next guest is Mr. Ivan Chung. He's from the Student Affairs Office here at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, where he is a senior manager. And I see a very nice word. He's a senior manager in the co-curricular learning in the residences and non-local student services. This is something that we often said that because of the work duties, teachers don't often know about the co-curricular. And now's our chance to learn with a very good guy, and expert too, at least to me. He'll deny it, I know. So Ivan, if you would unmute, please join us.
Thank you. And let me, I'm gonna, first of all, let me deny that. I'm not an expert. And number two, let me try to get the full screen on this first.
Sure.
Sorry. Let me go back.
I knew you'd deny it.
But thanks, John.
That's
I can do this first.
In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king.
How's that? Is that fine?
Good, thank you.
Great. So yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for the previous presenters, and especially the speakers as well. And Professor Betty and I met in Washington, D.C. a couple years ago at the Association of International Educators, and we did talk about some of the things that I'm going to share today, especially when it comes to, or maybe in the Q&A more, but when it comes to institutional challenges and barriers to some of this internationalization processes. Now, my ethnic heritage, my background is actually from Hong Kong, but I grew up in the US. And so it's kind of mixed in there with some US histories and our understanding of local, non-locals from US perspectives, and some of the socioeconomics and sociopolitics that happens there. So, so as we know, around the world has gone a little bit crazy of sorts. And so there's going to be a little bit of that in here, because when we're talking about internationalization, we do have to get a little bit into talking about the social politics and different things, especially when it comes to true diversity and multiculturalism, which is I define that as different than multi-ethnic. So we'll go over that in just a second. But yes, I do teach in the co-curriculum. I teach. What I'm trying to do is to curricularize. Is that a word? Curricularize the co-curriculum, making it more systematic, a little bit more pedagogical, and ways to expand on beyond the classroom learning. Because this is the one space, and I did used to teach university courses, many of them, actually several, and very different arenas, from philosophy from African perspectives. I've opened up I helped to open up some NGOs in East Africa, post-genocide areas, community development, microfinancing. I've also done a lot of different things in different kind of faith-based and non-faith-based NGOs around the world. And so in student affairs, it seems like a nice space to work in, especially in Hong Kong, for trying to develop some of this internationalization. And if we can all agree that it is a process, no one actually, and I'll share the definition in the very last slide, but there's no one that has a monopoly on what that is. And nobody can say that really, nobody can say that they do internationalization. That doesn't really make sense, because it's a process. And while there's different, what they call pillars, Hong Kong has focused in on 2 of those, maybe 4 or 5 pillars. And that happens to be recruitment and exchange, right? What we haven't focused in on are competencies, intercultural competencies. And so I'm still looking for the people in Hong Kong and all of Asia, actually, to actually teach competencies directly. And so while I'm looking for that, that's a big question mark in my head. I haven't seen them yet. and I think it's not available in the literature either. I have That's why I moved to Hong Kong. I brought my family from the U.S. to Hong Kong because I wanted to develop that a little bit more here. And then another a big kind of glaring gap over above that has been there is no such field as student affairs. Now, there are departments, there are people who work in student affairs, there are directors and deans and VPs of student affairs for sure. But there is no such field as a field of study, as an integrative, interdisciplinary field of study that intersects psychology, education, interculture, multiculture, peace and justice initiatives. I mean, you can name it, right? All these things comprise student affairs, at least as it was developed in the U.S. Now, again, it's different here in Hong Kong. So, what do people do? Well, people typically want fluent Cantonese and Mandarin speakers because of the politic of the day, and they want people who can kind of take care of students in hopefully holistic ways. But the big part of this, the gap when you put it together, was intercultural competencies. What I could see is intercultural competencies and within the umbrella of student affairs, and therefore the co-curriculum. Okay, add to that the hierarchies that exist within our educational institutions here, especially of higher education. Okay, add to that. And because if we're trying to do something truly educational and trying to do intercultural work, well, there has to be, I hate to say this because I want to honor cultures like ours, but there has to be some level of horizontalizing. And there has to be some level of, if what Professor Betty is going to be true in terms of partnership, seeing students as partners, collaborators, contributors, those two words she used, contributors and partners, then there has to be some horizontalizing of the hierarchies that exist, right? Am I correct? Okay. So stick with me here. So if that's true, then some of these concepts and practices might be viewed a certain way. Okay, I'll talk about it in a second. So here are very quickly, I know my time's almost up. Here are very quickly going to give you two practices that we've done that have to do with our learning rubrics that we've developed. And really quickly, here is something you can just quickly glance through. I call the top layer, what you can see, the 10% or even less of the iceberg, and you can use this iceberg model for many different things, from emotional intelligence. And by and large, a lot of our intercultural learning is truly understanding self and emotional intelligence, emotionally healthy communication, etc. And the top part I call the three F's, right? Food, fabric, and festival. Easy. Things that we can, if you take pictures of our activities, it's easy to just bring in people of different colors. Okay? That's the cheap stuff. Okay? And it's very important, as a matter of fact. But it's cheap because it's not deep. The deeper stuff is more difficult to learn and to teach. So if you're looking at teaching learning issues and pedagogies and methodologies, the bottom of the iceberg, the 90% of the iceberg is much more difficult to teach. And that's why, and more importantly, the reason why we often don't do that here in Hong Kong and Asia, because it's very difficult to assess and very difficult to present and to seek approval for. Understand? Okay. So here are three of the learning rubrics that I came up with about 4.5 years ago. And this blue one has to do with whole person competencies. And I'm using one of my mentors in intercultural learning. Her and her former husband developed a kind of an intercultural sensitivities model. It's a theory from denial to integration. Okay, denial, defense, minimization, acceptance, adaptation, integration. I've led seminars on how this works all together, how it flows, it could skip, etc. But then I also developed 7 subcategories under each of these three overarching competencies or roadmaps. Okay, from self-care, under whole person, we have self-care, care for others, all the way to life goals, all the way to care for the physical environment or green sustainability, if you will. Okay, and I articulate what a student's, if I were to individualize this, and if students were to construct their own learning, what it would look like. Okay, so that was whole. This is whole person. This is intercultural, and I call whole person the experience of choice. I call intercultural the experience of difference. Okay, and I'll focus on this in just a second. I'll focus on one of these roles because every one of these roles could be its own doctoral dissertation, which is actually what I'm trying to do. And then this is called servant leader. Okay, there's a difference between leadership and leader, if you will, and that's part of student affairs. Okay, what does leadership and leader, servant leader, look like in this Asian Hong Kong context in the midst of typhoons, protests, and pandemics? Okay, civic responsibility, social responsibility, those kinds of things. Okay, ethics, ethical servant leadership, self-awareness. So a lot of these overlap, but they are somewhat distinct. And this one gets to be a little bit more complex. Okay, and so I call this the experience of value. Okay, but in terms of interculture, it's the experience of difference. So from and this is what Janet Bennett calls ethnocentric stages to ethno-relative stages. There is a difference between ethno-relativity from something like ethical relativity. Okay, so here's one of the things that we did, very simply, a cultural show and tell, quote unquote. And this event was to fulfill some student learning in the area of empathy, understanding, and perspective taking. So if you can see how this works, the first three stages are a little bit more on the negative side. The last three stages a little bit more positive, and that space, chasm even, if you will, between minimization and acceptance, I call it intercultural conversion. Okay, for many reasons, it's a big chasm. But if students can get through and understand and be aware of, and most of us, even from the education ivory tower, probably in the minimization stages, if you will. If we were to be honest with ourselves, most of us are in the minimization stages. It's the same with other scorecards, the diversity, empathy, inclusion scorecards that was developed by USC, by University of Southern California. All these issues have to do with receptivity, life opportunities and access, excellence among faculty, staff. Most of us are in this minimization stages. Without really exploration, we just tend to want to emphasize the similarities rather than the differences. Okay, so this whole activity was to hopefully celebrate, educate, maybe a little bit of transformation towards some different perspectives, right? So let me show you this. Do we have this video here? You know what? Forget the video. We'll move on because we don't have much time. Oh, here it is. Maybe just a couple minutes or this. I don't have to go through the whole thing. You hear?
So this necklace is actually a gift from one of my students. Can we have a close look? It would just be, it looks like a procession, but it could be any procession. It's not a wedding procession, I don't think so.
Okay.
A wedding procession would usually have a groom and a lot of people in front of him. Okay, so well, this one, since we don't have preserving and promoting art, what they do nowadays is they make it in variable form. So this is a huge, this is a star.
this picture, it always reminds me to be an active team player, because for most of the teams, it's actually 1 plus 1 is greater than 2. And the second one will be the one which I received in Hong Kong.
This is the money of driving away the evil spirit, so we call it after in Chinese.
All right. Well, can I just ask for permission right now? We did practice physical distancing there at that moment because we had to. Can we change can I ask for permission right now? Change the nomenclature from social distancing to physical distancing. We want social nearness. We want intercultural rubbing of shoulders and nearness, but even if we have physical distancing, right? Another activity that we did in our House of Intercultural Living and Learning program, which is what Dr. Babak and Dr. MS was charged me with, was this House of Intercultural Living and Learning. And it's a huge program that has changed a little bit to scale up just a little bit because of our online modes. So one of the things that we can do online, which of course, we lose a lot not being face-to-face, because I don't think we can really learn comprehensively intercultural skills without being face-to-face. But there are certain things that we can learn online. We can scale it up. One of these is our story circles. This was brought about in a very simple manner, but it is about 100 pages. Dr. Babak can actually share with you that link that I have. You can access this whole 100-page online. It's brought about by one of my colleagues and friends, Dr. Darla Deardorff from Duke University. She's been working in intercultural skills development for a long time, and she developed a Routledge publishing format, sort of a story circles and different stages of sharing stories. Wonderful stuff. And in this kind of activity was trying to fulfill this part of the learning rubric in terms of cultural schemas, right? The inability of constructing these cultural categories all the way towards internalizing them more, articulating them more. Again, most of us being in the maybe more defense or minimization stages, we might, students might resist it, or they might get more curious about it. And we want them to be curious, right? And they begin demonstrating the ability to construct meaning in increasing complexity with cultural relativism and interpret things in kind of phenomena, right? In the right context, in other people's contexts, okay? So like I said, many of our ground rules have to do with emotionally healthy communication. That really is one of the first steps, psychologically wise, to be able to work and to learn these intercultural skills. So these are some of our ground rules, and I can share with you these later on. But just to share with you, I know we're out of time, but some of the feedback from this program, I want to give you some of which speaks into our goals and objectives. I can offer, and I'm using Bloom's taxonomy of measurable verbs so that people can really measure their self-rated gains as a result of this short activity. I can offer 2 reasons why I have a sense of belonging for a particular group or groups after this module. I can recognize 1 step that I need to practice in order to develop deep gratitude for something that is different about another person. Okay, I can recognize 1 element of stereotyping or generalizing. We did talk a little bit about racial or ethnic microaggressions, etc. Right? Here are some of the actual, and I wanted to share those feedback questions beforehand to let you know some of our goals in this. And here are some of the story circle questions in different breakout rooms. So what is 1 positive interaction from someone who is different, right? What made it positive? What is a challenging interaction or misunderstanding? Now, this is where students, enter into a little bit of discomfort. So to the question that was asked earlier about how do we do internationalization or intercultural learning at home and still and go through the process of discomfort? Well, it's very possible. In fact, it's supposed to be in our global cities, right? Because we have multiple cultures, and whenever two cultures come together, there's supposed to be not only celebration, but painful processes of trying to find our voices. Okay, that's what this question is getting into. Of course, it doesn't go as deep. There are other more in-depth activities that we do and other simulations, workshops that challenge students to have to deal with either themselves or with each other in ways that increase equitable living and learning, equitable social skills, intercultural skills, etc. Describe a time when you yourself realized you believe in a stereotype that was not true. What did you think led to that? And what made you realize it? Now, that's personal, right? But that's what intercultural learning has to be about partly. All right. Now, I wanted to end on a good note here of good people. So, describe a time when you felt supported by a community of friends, colleagues, families, neighbors, who are all similar and different. You know, how do they demonstrate support? So these are very important story circle questions. You can pick up on some of the, I derive some of these, I change a little bit. I definitely came up with those learning rubrics on my own, but they come from different, I guess I kind of regurgitate some of them through other models and theories, okay? Here's some of the debriefing moments that we had for the story circles. Okay, now there should, I think for every class, whether it's a STEM class or a intercultural class, can have some of these elements in it if we're trying to understand student initiated learning, right? Here's some of our, now, we've always had an issue in Hong Kong on local Hong Kong students interacting with other cultures. Always had that challenge. Many reasons for that. I don't need to get into that here. It has to do with our history of education, teacher security, and all that. Here's one of the local students giving their feedback on our residential education activities. He's hearkening back to an intercultural quest group activity. And he learned respect, how to share feelings, how to be more empathic, how to be affected by others' feelings, etc. So I can send you this PPT, and this is the original Jane Knight's internationalization definition, as far as I can tell. A lot has been added to this, but the main word here is process. So how do you measure process? Much more difficult, much more challenging than just mere numbers. But that type of process data is a little bit more difficult, and that's why we're doing our student affairs the way that we are. Thank you. Sorry, John.
Oh, no, thank you. It was a different kind. I mean, I think, you know, a lot of our teachers, we hear, and this is me too, we hear a lot of practical advice, but really the practical is informed by the theoretical. You know, there's that old quote, there's nothing as practical as a good theory. So I'm very grateful to have it. You know, I mean, anyway, thanks, man.